What's up, everyone? In this video, we're going to introduce the core concepts of Tailwind CSS. This will be the foundation of more detailed and advanced Tailwind concepts to come. Before we get started though, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I release a video about Tailwind, Payload CMS, nextjs, and more. If you'd like to see the code that I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. In the last Tailwind video, we started adding styles to one of our components, but that was just the beginning. It was a simple example that had no responsiveness or reactivity to different states. It was just a few colors and spacing adjustments that are necessary, but not enough to make a compelling design. After watching that video, you may be asking yourself, why not just use inline styles? Using utility classes feels very similar to inline styles at first, but the similarity ends when you realize the full potential of what Tailwind CSS can do. Inline styles do not enforce a design system, so you'll find yourself repeating a lot of similar code to get different results across your components if you just use inline styles. You're not able to target states like hover and focus with inline styles, so you'll be missing a lot of built-in CSS functionality if you use inline styles. And lastly, you're unable to use media queries using inline styles, so you'll never have a truly responsive site with inline styles alone. So yes, you are defining Tailwind classes inline, but the code is much cleaner and clearer and more powerful than using inline styles. Now, does Tailwind CSS make inline styles obsolete? No. Inline styles still come in handy if you're using a value that comes from a dynamic source like Payload CMS. If you define a set of values coming from the database, it might make sense to apply that directly to an inline style instead of trying to force it into a Tailwind class. You may also want to use inline styles for including more complicated strings of arbitrary values that might make it difficult to read what the classes are doing. It's also possible to use inline styles to set variables that get their values from a dynamic source. You can then reference those variables in your utility classes using parentheses to add them to your classes. With all of that out of the way, let's take a look more deeply into Tailwind CSS and all that it's able to accomplish. All states are handled by adding a prefix or variant to the beginning of the utility class you'd like to use. For example, if we wanted to add a different emerald color when we hovered over our component, we would simply add hover to the beginning of the class and add the color we'd like to show on hover. To make this clear and obvious, let's do hover BG emerald 950. So here we can do hover BG emerald 950. And so now when we save this and let our page refresh, we can see that when we hover over our section here, the background changes from the emerald color that it's at right now to the 950 shade of emerald. We can also handle transition durations, so this isn't so drastic. We'll need to add a transition duration 500 and hover transition hover duration 500. So we can do that by just adding duration 500 and transition. And then we can do the same thing with hover transition hover duration 500. Now when we load this back up, we can see that it's much less drastic and a smoother transition from light to dark. In typical CSS, you would usually add all your states to a single class, which means you have one class handling a slew of additional tasks beyond just styling the element. This can very quickly make your CSS files unreadable, hard to manage, and put yourself at risk of repeating yourself. Need to add multiple variants to an element? You can do that by chaining your variants together with a colon. For example, you can combine your disabled and hover states by doing something like disabled hover BG emerald 200. This will only apply to anything with the disabled and hover state together, which works great for things like a disabled button. Similar to managing the state or variants of your elements, you'll handle media queries by adding the variant you want followed by a colon, then the utility class you want to use. In the case of our components here, the image and text look fine at larger screen sizes, but they don't look so good at smaller sizes. Once we add more text, it'll likely start to stretch and look awkward, so let's adjust how our components look. We're really looking to adjust the look of these components at the smallest screen size. So let's just add MD : to the beginning of all of our spacing and layout utility classes in the rich text and image elements to reset our smallest size. We can then add call span 12 to both of them to make sure they take up all of their available space. So we can go to rich text and add call span 12 to both our rich text and image component. And when we refresh, we can see that both elements in this component is taking up all 12 columns. Then we can decide if at the smallest size, the text should show up at the top or the bottom. If we want it to be at the bottom, which I do, we'll add order last to our rich text. Now at our smallest size, we have this nice one column view that expands into a split screen at a medium sized media query. Tailwind CSS makes it easy to target dark mode as well. All you need to do is add the dark prefix or variant to the class you want to have different styles in dark mode. For example, let's say this is our light mode theme. Instead of having our hover variant as the background color change, let's change hover to dark and let that be our dark mode theme. We'll also add dark text emerald 50 to change our text color to be readable on the dark background. Since we're removing the hover state here, we can remove our transition, duration, and hover variants as well. And now that all of that's gone, we'll add dark text emerald 50. Now when I refresh that, since my system is in dark mode, we can see that our components have updated to the dark mode theme. Now we'll force our browser to change its preference to light mode, so we can see that this change takes place at the color scheme level. So we'll change that back to our system and then close our developer tools there. In Tailwind CSS, you'll find that you use multiple utility classes to build up the value of one CSS property, like blur and transition, which we just used earlier. You can set the base class blur small on your image, which works on its own to blur the image, or you can add grayscale to the image, which works on its own to put the image into grayscale. So to see this at work, we can do grayscale for our image, and we'll see both images turn grayscale. And we can also do blur small, which will just blur the images. But if we do both, this is building all on the filter property in the image classes. So now we've got a blur and grayscale on our image here, but they're both using the same filter property. Both of these utility classes use the filter property like I mentioned and adds the variable only for the effect that it's meant to apply and only if the class is set. So putting these classes together result in a unique combination of both blur and grayscale without added complexity in your code. And this is how Tailwind also handles gradients, transitions, and more. What if you need to use values that fall outside of the theme you or Tailwind provided? For example, what do you do if you want to use the true colors of your social media icons that might be included in the footer? Or what if you want to use a different value for your padding? Well, you can do that using arbitrary values. Let's change our BG Emerald 400 to a hex value, for example. You can do that simply by changing the Emerald 400 part to a hex value in a set of square brackets. We'll use AFA in our background, and since we're in the dark mode, we're going to change the value there in the dark mode. And then we can change our padding to be something like 6 rem, just so we can very clearly see this change being made. And so here we see an arbitrary value of 6 rem being added to the padding of our components, as well as in dark mode, our background color being set to this hex value AFA. You can use more advanced CSS features too, like calc and setting different widths for your grid columns. This is where knowing CSS well can come in handy when using Tailwind. Building projects with utility classes can save time, but it also opens you up to repeating yourself. There are several ways to deal with this, one of which we've been doing by setting up this component. Since we're using nextjs, which is a front-end framework, we have the ability to use components to reduce the number of times we need to repeat ourselves. The component we're working on is a block within our payload CMS backend, so every time we use this block, it will render this component with the code already in it. That means we only need to define the component once and use it anywhere we need it. It will have the same consistent style, and editing the component's code will edit it everywhere. No more worrying about updating multiple similar elements and keeping them consistent. It's handled for us. Using loops can also cut down on code. Similar to using components, we can define the line of code once and then loop through it, rendering the same code over and over again in that loop. This saves us time and effort by creating the code once and then using our backend to define how many times we need to add the code. This prevents us from having to worry about any duplicative effort. What if you're editing something that might not be loopable, but does share classes between several elements? Most, if not all, IDEs come with the ability to select multiple lines to edit at the same time. In my case, in a JetBrains program, PyCharm, I'm able to select multiple lines by simply pressing Option and selecting multiple lines of code, and then I can just type, and it types on multiple lines at the same time. Sometimes we make mistakes in our classes and add conflicting utility classes that need to be resolved. For example, including two display utility classes like flex and grid doesn't work. An element can't have both values. Just like it is in CSS, the class that comes later wins. So if you put flex second, your element will be display flex. But if you put grid second, your element will be display grid. If you want the ability to change how things are laid out between grid and flex using dynamic values, you'll want to use conditional logic to render it correctly. It is still possible to use the important modifier if you need to ensure that a certain utility class is chosen despite specificity. Simply adding an exclamation mark at the end of your utility class will add the important modifier. Lastly, if your project has class names that conflict with Tailwind CSS utilities, you'll want to prefix all the Tailwind generated classes and CSS variables using the prefix option. To do this, we can go to our globals.css, change our imports to add prefix TW to the end of each of the statements. I don't encourage you to do this unless you have those conflicting class names, because in order to use any Tailwind utility class, you'll need to add TW : or any custom prefix you set here to the class in order to activate the Tailwind classes. So with this new prefix, we would have to change our component to have TW : added to all class names. And that's unnecessary since we don't have any class name collisions. So if I save this, we can see all of our styles will disappear unless I add TW to the beginning of every class name. And I'll only do this section instead of the entire component, just so we can see the styles come back. But we don't need to do this. We don't have any class name collisions, so I'll remove that and remove our prefixes here. And now when I save, we should see our classes come back to normal. This is just the fundamentals of Tailwind CSS. There's a lot you can do with utility classes, and we've barely scratched the surface. Over the course of the next couple of Tailwind videos, we'll unpack each of these sections in more detail to help you build compelling designs with more complex patterns. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you never miss when I release more content around Tailwind, Payload CMS, nextjs, and more. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.